much attention could come out of little Jerusalem, which is so insignificant in the scope of the world, as far as the world is concerned, that this little town, this little place could cause such an impact that it would affect the whole world. That is a big deal. So, the rulers knew where the body in the tomb was. Okay? Rome knew where the body and the tomb was. The followers certainly knew where the body and the tomb was. Listen to Mark, because I'm turned there, we'll read Mark's account, chapter 15, verse 47. After Joseph had put Jesus in the tomb, verse 47 says, "And Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, observed where he was laid." Now, you can't get any much clearer than that in the fact that the Bible says they watched this happen. They knew where the grave was. They observed where his body was laid. So they knew where the tomb was. The disciples knew, because when we get to John 20, we're going to find Peter and John not ask for directions, but they jump up and they run to the tomb to check out everything for themselves. Now, why did we make a big deal about where the tomb is? Because, again, the fact that everyone knew where it was, and the fact that everyone was trying to prevent the resurrection, and the fact that an angel descended from heaven at that place and it is empty, and Jesus is appearing, the risen Jesus is appearing to his followers and to his disciples, the fact that it wasn't hidden, that it was so out in the open, well, that takes away any excuse that you may have to say that the resurrection was a fabrication. You just simply cannot do that. It will not allow it. Now, the event itself. Let's look at the resurrection. And again, I hope in helping you understand and untangle this step-by-step process and looking at everything together, the events will make a lot of sense. Because as you look at this, sometimes it may seem like one gospel writer is saying one thing and another gospel writer is saying another. Again, that's not the case. They compress things together to give you the idea and the general message, which is everyone knew where the tomb was. The tomb is empty. He is raised. And all of his followers were skeptical because a resurrection is hard to believe in. But the evidence was so overwhelming because the best way to show somebody you're raised, guess what it is? Show up. Appear. Stand before them. That's a pretty good way to show everybody that you are raised from the dead. And then say, touch me, feel me, give me something to eat. I'm a real person. I am raised. So let's look at the event in the order that they happen. And we're going to start where I told you to initially go, in the book of Matthew, chapter number 28. And let's read the very first event of the resurrection. This is the frightened guard and the angel that descended. And I tell you, I can see why the guards would be frightened. Let's read it. Let's talk about it. Verse number 1. And after the Sabbath, at the first day of the week, began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven. And he came and he rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. And his countenance was like lightning, and his clothes was white as snow. And the guards shook for fear and became like dead men. Now, what an event this was. Imagine if you are the guards who are there. We've already pointed out in previous times that guards is plural, and the way that they would separate, the way they generally would set the guards in place. Your coloring pages as a kid lied to you, okay? There wasn't one or two people standing there. Some of them, plural, went into the city, which meant some of them did not. And so at the very minimum, you could have 4, but probably in a guard, you'd have at least 12 or maybe more. But here they are at the tomb, okay? They're bored. They know that they have to be here all night. And now a familiar thing happens that has been happening in this very unusual week. Another earthquake. I mean, we had one when he died, and it split rocks, it burst open graves, and it rent the veil in half that was inside of the temple. And now, all of a sudden, on this resurrection morning, while it is the new day, but it is still dark out, and the earth starts to quake, and the epicenter from where this is coming from is the place of the tomb. Now, why is it coming from there? Well, because the angel is descending from heaven. That is the cause of this particular earthquake. And as he descends, while the earth is shaking and the guards are feeling the ground underneath them moving, they see this being coming from heaven, and he has not hid his heavenly glory. He has not veiled it in any way. And so his face is like lightning. It is shining. It is bright. This is one of these experiences that parallels the angel encounters you see in the Old Testament. When they see an angel, the majesty of this is so great and so grand that they hit the ground. And on top of that, his apparel, his clothing, it is shining like snow, like raiment. Now, you know what snow is, right? We're in Florida, so I'm not sure if you do. Well, one of the things I remember, I hated driving in it. And one thing in particular that made driving in the snow very difficult is after it snowed, when the sun came out, people say, "Do you miss the snow?" I don't miss it one bit. All it did was it looked real pretty for about 1 hour, and then after about an hour, people started driving through it, and it looked like dirty black sludge all over the road, right? But when the sun would come out and hit the snow, that is the brightest bright that you've ever seen in your life. I mean, it's almost like looking into the sun. You have to put your sunglasses on. There's no way that you could drive without that. This is the way that this angel's appearance was as he hit the ground. Now, this is a majestic scene that they see. Now, he does something rather remarkable. He moves the stone by himself. Now, it wouldn't be hard to put it in place because it is slanted downhill. One person could have probably pried under and got it to roll over the grave covering. But to get that at least 2,000-pound stone to go up the hill, that is a pretty big deal. And even the women were worried about that later on, weren't they? How are we going to find enough people to move this stone? But here comes the angel. He hits the ground. He grabs the stone. He rolls it over like it's weightless. And then he climbs on top of it, and he sits down on the stone just like it was an effortless task that he has completed. Now, this is what the guards have taken in. They're watching all of this. What is their reaction? Just like you would expect it to be. Now, we read this, okay, but let's look at it again. Verse number 2 says that as he came and he took the stone and he rolled back the door, his countenance was bright. But verse 4 says, the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. So literally, they're so scared. Their emotional rush is so great that they can no longer have control over their nervous system. Their knees are quaking. Their hands are shaking. I'll tell you another time the Bible describes this very well is when there is an evil king using, and Daniel comes in and interprets a dream. Belshazzar is taking the holy instruments from the temple that he brought back to Babylon when they captured it by God's judgment. And they're making light, and they're using these things, these instruments from the temple for vile things. And all of a sudden, he sees a giant hand appear and take its finger and starts writing on the wall. And when he sees this, he starts to shake and he starts to tremble at what he's seeing. This is the idea with the guards. And then they faint like a dead man. In other words, they pass out, they hit the ground. This is how overwhelming the scene is that they have taken in. It is an amazing thing to think about. So these are the guards, they're witnessing this. And in verse 11, later on, okay, there's many things that's going to happen, I think, between this and verse 11. But in verse 11, you're going to see they wake up and they go into the city. And when they go into the city, they're in a conundrum here, okay, because they failed in their mission. And if you failed in a particular mission like this, the penalty was death. So instead of going to their higher-ups like Pilate, they went to the Jews who were so worried about it, those leaders, because they didn't have the authority to put them to death, and said, here's what's happened. You're not going to believe it. An angel came from heaven and rolled back the stone. Now, there's one more thing that I want you to notice about this before we go to the next event is when the stone was rolled back, Jesus was not in there. He was already raised. That wasn't to let him out. It truly and literally was, despite how cute the memes are. It's true. It was to let people in to see that the grave was empty. So he rolls this away. Now, let's go to the very next event that happens. And this is going to involve a group of women. Now, this group of women, I did my best to try to time this out. Take it for what it's worth. I think it's accurate. I don't claim for it to be perfect. Now, I think this happened right about where the sun would have been, starting to rise right before 5 a.m., and what we see with these women are going to be about 5 o'clock in the morning. And the Bible, I want you to picture this, describes this in 3 ways, okay? Matthew 28:1, the first day of the week began to dawn. So it's beginning to dawn. It's not there, it is just beginning. But Mark also tells us something about what this scene looks like. Chapter 16 and verse 2 of Mark says, very early in the morning, it's very early in the morning when the sun has risen. So the sun has just started to peak. But when the sun first starts to peak, it doesn't by any means mean that it is daylight yet. Listen to how John describes it in chapter 20 and verse 1. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been moved away from the tomb. And so this twilight, this dusk that you see, right when the sun is going down, but you still see the glow of it in the sky, or in the morning, right when it's coming up, and you start to see that the stars are being vanquished in a general area, but it is still dark. You can start to faintly make out big objects, like a big stone that covers a tomb, but you couldn't make out little, smaller, detailed objects. And to make it even worse, for viewing things this early in the morning, okay, the sun would come from the east, coming out of the desert. The Mount of Olives towers over the city until the sun actually crests over the Mount of Olives. And even then, the shade, the angles, the shadows would be very long. It made it very difficult to see. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters for this reason, because it's going to affect how Mary Magdalene sees things. Okay? So, about 5:15 in the morning or something, back to Matthew chapter 28, verse 1, says, the first day of the week began to dawn. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. Now, if we're going to put together all of the gospel accounts, we're going to see that there are more people than just these two, but we'll look at that later. For this reason, Mary Magdalene separates herself from the rest of the pack. Now, we don't know why. It wasn't uncommon in that day. It's a walking culture. She just maybe was more excited. She might have been younger than the rest. The others had some grown-up children, but Mary, I think, indicates Magdalene. She was younger, and she separates from herself, and she gets a head start, and she reacts differently and sees things differently than what the rest of the women are going to see. So when she arrives, what is it that she sees? She sees that the stone is rolled away. Now, that's all that she sees. Now, to get this in writing, look at John chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was dark and saw that the stone had been rolled away. Then she ran to Simon and Peter, and the rest of the women did not do this. Now remember, it's dark, it is hard to see, and you can see the big objects faintly, but you're not going to be seeing the small objects like passed out guards laying down on the ground under the shadows. But as she comes, she jumps to a conclusion. She sees the stone rolled away, and she doesn't go in and look, not at this time, not Mary Magdalene. And she sees that, and in her mind, the first thing that pops up, not expecting a resurrection, is they have taken his body, and they have moved it somewhere. So before she even gets to the tomb, she turns around, and verse 2 of John 20 says she runs to where Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loves, that is how John describes himself, where they are staying. And at the moment, they are not with the rest of the disciples. They're together. And that's not uncommon in these accounts either. In some accounts, 7 will be together. In other accounts, doubting Thomas won't be with them. They're not always the 11 of them that are left always together. So she sees this. She runs over to where John is. She runs over to where Peter is. And she makes her way in pure shock. Don't forget that she runs. And she doesn't even take the time to look inside of the tomb, which is where the angels, plural, are now. She sees the stone, she turns, and she runs, and she makes her way over to where Peter and John are staying. Now, that she has done this, at about 5:15 a.m., at about 5:30 to 6 o'clock a.m., the rest of the women finally get to the tomb, those whom she has separated herself from as she moves along. Now, we're going to find what we need to know about this in Mark chapter 16, verses 2 through 7. Just look at that for a moment. Matthew 16, verse 2, very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun has risen. So it's up a little higher. It is indicating that there's a little more brightness in the day. And the other ladies, the other women, they get there. And verse 3, they said among themselves, who will roll the stone away as they're approaching? But when they looked up, when they got close, they saw that the stone had been rolled away because it was large. And they entered the tomb, something Mary did not do, and they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting in the tomb on the right side, and they were alarmed. And this young man, who will be an angel, said, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Go and see the place where they have laid him. And then go and tell the disciples and tell Peter, he's going before you to Galilee. You'll meet him there. You'll see him there. He is risen just like he said that he would. In verse 8, now you get this emotion. They went out quickly. They fled from the tomb. They're trembling. This very much resembles the guards, right? You don't see an angel and not have some sort of reaction. That is why every time you meet an angel, the first thing they usually say, if they're coming on your behalf is, what do they say first thing? Fear not. There's a reason for that, because when you see one, you're going to fear. And they see this, they run out of the tomb, they are afraid, they are trembling, they're still processing what is happening, they don't know what's going on. And verse 8 says, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. They talked among themselves, but on the way to the disciples, they weren't stopping people saying, you need to go here, you need to go there. They are so frightened that it has put a holy hush on these women. So they have arrived. This is the second scene. They see this, and now they have seen the angel. They're the first ones to see the angels besides the guard. But notice yet, so far, no one has yet seen the risen Christ. He's going to show up in a minute. Now, here's the thing about these angels that we see here, and I want you to know about this. Matthew told us about one, and Mark told us about one. But listen to what Luke says in chapter 24 and verse 4. Verse 4 says, as this happened, they were greatly perplexed about this. Behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. Now, this is kind of the language also. The angels in there sitting down, but the angels are kind of doing supernatural things. It's like they don't see them, and then all of a sudden they do see them. But that is the way that heavenly beings can work. John says there are 2. Luke says there are 2. But what you have to understand in the way that you would write in literature 2,000 years ago, if one person was the main speaker and there was 10, you would only mention the one. You didn't have to mention the others. The Bible does this in other places, such as with the maniac at Gadara. There was more than just him. There were two by some gospel accounts, but since he was the main character involved, Matthew again implores that writing technique, which is to make mention of the one who is playing the main role inside of the narrative that is being told. So we do see two angels. We see that they are young looking, taking on the appearance of a young man, and we see that they have a heavenly glory about them, a face like lightning and a countenance that is radiating, and their clothes are shining very brightly, and it is something otherworldly and supernatural that is being shown. Now, to continue with this, who were the women that were there? Well, again, for sake of time, I'll give you some references and I'll list the women, but we're not going to read each verse. Firstly, there was Mary Magdalene who went first. Then there was another Mary, Matthew 27:56, who is the mother of Joseph and James. Now, there's a lot of Marys in the Bible, aren't there? Now, there's a reason for that. Moses' sister was named Miriam. And because Moses was so popular, it became a thing to name the women after his sister Miriam. By the time the name had changed through the way words evolved, by this time the name was Mary. So there's a lot of Marys. There's another lady, Mark 16:1, Salome. She is the mother of James and the mother of John, two of the disciples. There is also Joanna, Luke 24, verse 10. She is the wife, history tells us, of one of Herod's stewards. So she's a very influential woman, at least her husband would have been. And so the vision of the angels, as you see it, it is overwhelming. It is perplexing to the people that have seen it. And these angels are absolutely causing people to leave terrified when they see. Now, fast forward a few more minutes. Let's say it's about 6 o'clock-ish now. The women have seen this. They turn and they're running back to where the disciples are, the biggest majority of them. But where Mary Magdalene went, remember, was to find Peter and John specifically that were at another place. Now, as the women are leaving, it's just like a play. The curtain closes, it opens, and there's a new scene. Here now, Peter and John arrive at the scene. All right, so back to John chapter 20. Look at verses 3 and 4. Well, actually, let's start with verse 2. She arrived. She said to the disciples, John and Peter, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." This is not what the information the other women have. They have seen the angels, and the angels have told her, "He is risen. Go tell Peter and the others to meet him in Galilee." He did just what he said he would do. He rose again. But remember, Mary Magdalene got ahead of the pack. She went, did not go in the tomb, just saw this panic turn, ran to John, ran to Peter, and says, "We don't know where he is." So here is John, and here is Peter. She's panicking, knocking at the door, and says, "They've taken the body, and we don't know what they've done with it." So they're up, and now they're running to where the tomb is. And verse 4, I love how the Bible says this. So they both ran together, and the other, John, outran Peter and came to the tomb first. He just had to put that in, didn't he? Yeah, I'm athletic. Peter, Now, there's an interesting thing that it is an argument from silence. But Mary Magdalene will end back up at the tomb after Peter and John have got there and have left. So in reality, John has outrun Peter, and Peter has outrun Mary Magdalene, because they're really going to arrive 1, 2, 3 in this order. But Peter isn't too far behind, and so look at what happens. Verse 5, he stoops down, and looking, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he didn't go in. And then Simon came, being a few steps behind, following him. Simon is all in, isn't he? That's the way Peter works. He just runs in, and he saw the linen cloths laying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. There's so much you can take from this. Number one, the shroud of, I forgot what it's called. Turin. It's not real. How do I know? Because that is one big cloth. The way that Jews buried people were in strips, cloths. They would wrap it one at a time. It wasn't quite like mummification. It's not like that at all. There was no mummification. But they would wrap. So that does not match at all the description that even the Bible gives that continues on what is the normal process of Jewish burial. They were in a hurry, but it still says they used the cloths, which have been the linen strips that would have went around. That's the first thing you can glean from this if you like the Discovery Channel, okay? Here's the second thing that you can glean from this. I mean, this is confusing. Because if they move the body, who folds the napkin in a nice little square and just lays it down? And how are the strips still there in the shape of a body, but there's no body inside of the strips? I mean, you're probably wondering, just like John and just like Peter, what is going on here? I mean, if you're going to do something like this, you're in a hurry. And secondly, how do you keep the shape of this without... It's just a fascinating thing. They don't know what to think about it. I can't say that I would know what to think about it if I was in that day, in their place, feeling the things that they're feeling, experiencing the things that they have experienced. But verse 7, the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen, it's just folded together, laid in a place by itself. And the other disciple who came to the tomb first, John, he just cannot resist saying, yeah, outrun that guy. He went in and looked. Peter didn't, but John saw it and he believed. What did he believe? Oh, he has been telling me he was going to be raised again. He was going to rise again. Peter is still skeptical. As a matter of fact, I think Peter's going to come to the tomb again. I'll show you that as we move through the step-by-step processes. And then the disciples went away again to their own homes. So again, you see they're split up. They're going away to their different places. Okay, so they're seeing this. They're still trying to figure out what is going on. So about 6 o'clock, John and Peter visit. Now, remember the second story that's going on here. This group of women have run back to tell the other disciples. So let's say now that it's 6:30, 7, I don't know, but I think that's a pretty close estimate. A lot is going on this morning. And so as soon as Peter and John leave, I mean, they don't spend a lot of time there. Now, Mary Magdalene, remember she went and told John and Peter. They all ran back together. John got there first. Then Peter caught up. And now, as they're making their way back to their homes, now Mary Magdalene shows up again at the grave. Verse 11. But Mary stood outside the tomb and she started weeping. And as she wept. This is the first time she looked in the tomb. Remember the first time she didn't do that. She just saw the stone. It's still dark. And she turned and she ran straight. And now in her weeping, the angels have told the other women he's risen. But she's still weeping thinking that it's just a missing body. That they've taken it and that they've put it somewhere else. So she's weeping for that reason. And when she looked in, now she sees for the first time 2 angels. Verse 12. The 2 angels are sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet where the body of Jesus was laying. Now, one of 2 things is happening here. She is freaking out because she's got wrong information, but she's not freaking out that she's seeing an angel. This is the first one who's not done this, right? So what is happening? One of 2 things. Either she's so distraught that she just can't think straight, right? That happens sometimes to people. But, there's this other thing as well. Hebrews chapter 13 tells us that angels don't always have to appear like angels. Sometimes the Hebrew writer tells us that people have entertained as guests angels, unaware that they were angels, but that they were actually people. Now, as I say that, yes, it can happen, but don't go angel crazy, okay? Don't think everybody you see is an angel, and don't buy me ceramic angels for Christmas either, okay? I thought that was kind of funny because my dad would get 3 or 4 every year, 3 or 4 ceramic angels. I mean, we had enough ceramic angels. We could have started a yard sale of ceramic angels, So maybe that's happening. But she says, she's still operating under the old assumption. Why are you weeping? She says, verse 13, they've taken my Lord and I don't know where they laid him. Now, when she said this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. Now, she was the first one to see the resurrected Christ. What a privilege this would be, right? To be the first one to see the resurrected Christ. But she's not expecting a resurrection. So she sees somebody, but she is yet clueless. what a point this is. It's amazing what you see when you look for it and what you miss when you don't look for it, right? I had a friend that I did glass work with. I mean, maybe God could have just held her eyes, but I don't think that's the case here. And every time that we would end the day and end back up at the shop, he would have something of great value in the back of his glass van. A lawnmower, a Craftsman tiller, fiberglass ladder. I mean, a spade, a set of shovels. I mean, this guy had everything. I started to think that he was just a real good thief. And I said, where do you get all this stuff? And he says, well, it's on the side of the road. So we drive up and down the interstate all day long. And it's just sitting on the side of the road. You just got to look for it. And I said, so-and-so, I drive up and down the same road you do, and I don't see all this stuff. And he said, well, you just got to have an eye for it. I remember about a week later, we had to do a two-man job, and I was riding with him, and sure enough, he put on his brakes, he goes over the side of the road, he's out, he's getting this big trash can, he's getting a couple of other things that are laying on the side of the road. He saw them, and I didn't see them. Why? He was looking for it, right? So Mary's not looking for this, not at all. And Jesus says, verse 15, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for? She supposed him to be a gardener. She said, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me what you've done, where you've laid him. I'll take him away. I'll take on the responsibility. And Jesus is just looking at her and he goes, Mary. All of a sudden it clicked. Rabboni. Teacher. Don't cling to me yet, he said. I've got to send it to my Father. But Mary Magdalene now, verse 18, is going to take off to find the gathering of the disciples. What a moment that was. Holding a conversation with the Lord. Didn't even know it till he said, Mary, right here, Mary. Sometimes that should make us wonder, what is God doing in our life that we're not seeing? Because we're not looking for Him in the things that are happening. All kinds of lessons in the Bible, aren't there? So that's the next step. But now, there's still things going on, remember? Still things happening. We have the group of ladies who have run back to the disciples. And now while they're on their way back, this is an amazing thing that the resurrected Jesus does. He disappears and He appears wherever He wants. It doesn't matter if there's a door, you don't got to open it. It doesn't matter if there's windows, you don't got to open them. He just appears. And as they are running back, scared to tell the other disciples, now Jesus appears to them on the road. Matthew chapter 28, and we'll go through this as quickly as we can, verse number 9 and 10. And as they went to tell the disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, Rejoice! And they came and held Him by the feet, and they worshipped Him. And Jesus said, Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren, go to Galilee, and there they will see me. Now here's the second group that got to see the resurrected Jesus, and that was a group of women. As they're running back now to tell the disciples, an angel told us that Jesus is risen. Now Jesus appears to them, validating what the divine revelation from the angel has told them. They see Him with their own eyes. There they are. There He is. Now, I want you to think about the torrent of emotions that these women have went through, okay? Think about this. Firstly, they arrive in great sorrow. I mean, all this is like within an hour. It's like being on a roller coaster of emotions, right? Then they see an angel and they're shaking and they're afraid. And then as they go, they start to process this. They don't talk to anybody else but among themselves. That Matthew says the feeling of joy starts to develop. And all of a sudden they find the risen Lord, and now they are down into worship. I mean, they have just up and down every gamut. You just take the whole spectrum of feelings that you can have and intensify it to the biggest degree that you can. And here, this is what these ladies have been on in this past hour. Now, here's the amazing thing. Go back to Luke chapter 24. And I am aware of the time. We're going to push through very quickly. Luke chapter 24 and look at verse number 9. Now, this is following exactly on the account of these women that we're talking about, okay? Verse number 9, they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to all of the rest. Now the 11, does that mean Peter and John were there at this time? They had a lot to talk about, maybe. But remember, you see the phrase the 11 or the phrase the 12 as a general way to speak of the disciples, okay? Just as you might use the phrase the firefighters to speak of, in general, the group that are firefighters. But either way, they're there, and this is what's happening. Verse 11 says, their words seemed to them like idle tales, but they did not believe them. Now I think John and Peter has come back together at this place because, verse 12, Peter arose and ran to the tomb and stooped down, and he saw the linen clothes laying by themselves, and he departed, marveling at what had just happened. I think this is Peter's second trip that he has made to the tomb for two reasons. Reason number one, this is placed after the group of women have been to the tomb. The first trip is placed right after Mary Magdalene. These are two different groups, two different messengers. The first time Mary Magdalene came with a different message. His body is not there. Where is it? This is a different group of people coming with a different message. He's raised. We saw an angel, and then we saw the resurrected Christ. So you'd imagine that morning that all the disciples got together, including Peter, the spokesman for them, and John, and they're thinking, what in the world is going on? And now all these women show up, and they're talking about this, giving these reports of resurrection from the angels and from Christ, and he just has to get up and he has to go and look at it again. It wouldn't be that far for him to run to in a walking culture. You think that's far-fetched? Let me ask you this. How many of you have ever bought a car and had to go look at it 2 times? Right? You ever bought a house and went to it more than once before you bought it? I have, right? You think you wouldn't do the same if your Lord had been risen and you're trying to figure out what is going on? That is by no means any type of stretch. So that is an amazing thing. Now let me just fill in the details of all the appearances that the Bible speaks about after that, and I'm just going to tell them to you. We're not going to take time to look at them because it's too late. We really don't have much more said about who he appears to. Now this is about 7 in the morning or something. Now we go all the way down to about 4 o'clock. It's the 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And Luke 24 verses 13 through 35 tells us just 2 disciples, not the disciples, just 2 followers on the Emmaus road. And he walks with them, and they end up at their place, and he eats with them, and all of a sudden they realize we've seen the risen Christ. Now, according to 1 Corinthians 15:5 and Luke 24:34, sometime right after this, right before this, around that time, he appears to Simon Peter. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Remember, he's so skeptical. John believed, but Peter didn't believe. Peter's went back to the tomb a second time, and the only conclusion he has is he's marveling, what is going on? What do I make of this? So Jesus appears specifically, according to Paul and Luke, to Peter himself. Then between about 7 or 8 p.m. that same day, John 20 verses 19 to 24, he appears to 10 disciples. Thomas is missing. And by the way, it's bad to miss out on what God is doing because it's another entire week before Thomas gets to see Christ. Another week later, John 20, verse 24 through 29, he appears to all of them, including Thomas. After these things, John chapter 21, the whole chapter, he appears to 7 of them who just decided they're going fishing. We see the risen Lord, but we don't know what this means. Don't ever feel bad if you don't get it. They went back fishing, okay? Don't feel bad if you don't get it. They certainly didn't. And then Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15:6, after that, putting these things in order, he says, over 500 people at one time saw him in Galilee. And after that, 1 Corinthians 15:7, he appeared to James. Then after that, Acts 1, verses 3 through 11, the ascension. Whatever time he spent teaching them before the ascension, which was quite a bit of time that he spent with the disciples, they saw him there. And then to Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:8, at much later date, I am the very last one, Paul says, that saw Jesus on the Damascus road. He appeared and I saw him. Now, that is just an amazing account of what you see at the resurrection. All right, so what does this mean? Why did we go verse by verse we are instance by instance to put in order these things of the resurrection. One, I want you to see that there's not any confusion about what is put in the Word of God, okay? It is there the way that it's supposed to be there. Now, secondly, this attests to something that is very wonderful and very great. When you put all these things together, it puts a hedge around any theory that could be anything other than the resurrection. Well, how do you know this person didn't hallucinate and see Jesus? Because you do that in grief. He was seen of over 500 people at once. I got a question. You give 500 people LSD, are they going to hallucinate the same thing? One person might see a missing loved one. Another person might see a dragon guarding the sandwiches in the refrigerator. You know, they're not going to all see the same thing. It just doesn't work like that, okay? Another thing this does is this puts all these eyewitnesses together, proving the disciples didn't take the body. They couldn't have. You see, people would not die a painful death over something that they made up over hoax. I know that because the most powerful men in the nation couldn't keep quiet about the truth whenever Watergate happened, and it wasn't near on the same levels of something like this. People are not going to die willingly and painfully and foolishly. Oh, you might get one to do it, but you're not going to have this many people that do this. Thirdly, an eyewitness account is very powerful. Paul says in his Corinthian account, you don't believe me? Right now while I'm writing this, most of those 500, some have passed on, but most of them are alive. You go talk to them yourself, and they're going to tell you the stories that I'm telling you that they line up. Now, why is that important? Because that means that this isn't a fairy tale that was made up 100 years or 200 years later. You want to know what is amazing about this? Let me tell you. I remember my grandma telling me she knew where she was at the day JFK got assassinated and she heard about it. Now, what if I was to try to tell my grandma, well, what happened on that day was a group of aliens from outer space flew their spacecraft in and they dropped down to Earth and they held up and barricaded the parade and they shot lasers at JFK and they killed him. Now, I've got a question for you. If I come up with that as the way, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Do you think I would get away with it? Why not? Everybody saw it. I remember where I was when 9/11 happened. It was my day off work. I'd slept in, hadn't turned on the TV, and I finally turned on the TV. I thought, what is this? And I went to another channel, it's there. Another channel, it was there. Another channel. And then I realized when it was even like on TV land, oh, this must be a big deal, you know. And what if I tried to tell everybody in here that, oh, yeah, aliens came from outer space and the aliens shot lasers through the building and beamed people up and that's what happened? Do you think I'd get away with that? Why? Because people, this is what Paul is saying. The Gospel of Mark was written in 40 A.D., probably, okay? Jesus died in 30 or 33 A.D. The story of Jesus is not a story, it's reality. If it was something made up, everyone who is still alive, Paul is even writing after that. It would not continue to the day because all the people that were there would have looked at this and said, that's not how that happened. I was there. But the opposite thing took place. Paul said, since we have nothing to hide, you go to the people who were there and you ask them, and you're going to find that their story matches the very things that we're writing. The very same things that are our creeds. 1 Corinthians 15, verse number 3. I give to you, first of all, which I received, one of the earliest church creeds, how that Christ died for our sins according to our Scriptures, that He was buried, and that He was risen again according to the Scriptures. That was being passed around. All Christians knew that within a year and a half, probably, of the church being founded in the book of Acts. And why did it keep happening? Because you go to the eyewitnesses and you say, is this how it happened? Guess what they all said? Yes, I was there and I saw it. These are the amazing things that the story of the resurrection does. It puts a hedge of protection around anything. God thought of it all. Puts a hedge of protection around anything coming in trying to defile or to value the story if you know your Scripture. Okay. Next week, I'm going to give you 15 minutes back, okay? Since it's 7:02. Let's end at this time, and then we'll take a prayer request when the live stream ends. Who has the first prayer request tonight?